All right, announcements for tonight are this. We are really excited about life groups that are starting. I'm looking out here and seeing that most of you are actually in a group, which is super exciting. So people at home, our life groups are starting this week for, I think, all of them. And if you have not had the chance to sign up for one of those, this is your last chance for the fall quarter. And that commitment goes from October, the first week of October, through December break, which is like around the 19th or 20th of December, depending on kind of what your group decides. So that's the commitment that you make, and we like to have nice on-ramps and off-ramps for you as well. So that would be the commitment that you're making. Hopefully you would be able to get into one of those groups. I know that community is such a huge deal for many of us right now. Those groups are meeting in person, but they're also online. And so we just invite you to get involved, to see other people's faces and connect and talk about real life stuff. You do not have to know the Bible like the back of your hand in order to be in a group. This is a place to just explore what we're learning about on Sunday mornings. That's really what the first 4 weeks are going to be about, is whatever they're talking about on Sunday or Saturday night, for those of you that come in here live. And so just come. Please come and explore that, and I think that you'll find that it's a really cool thing to do. You fill out your online communication card, or you can text that number, the word group, to that number, and Jason will reach out to you right away and get you connected. Tomorrow morning is the official opening of the Village. So, yeah. We don't have a ton of kids, but I love that because we can kind of get our bearings a little bit and hopefully just create some momentum and comfort so that people that are coming feel like they could share that with their friends and invite their friends to come. We understand and realize that some school districts right now are starting to step into in-person learning at the end of October. And so we are expecting the Village to really meet middle school, late elementary and middle school needs that there are. Brooklyn's doing a happy dance over there, and so is Trevor. You can't see him at home, that he's sitting by her, but Trevor is a certified middle school teacher, so I think that it's pretty great that those little ones are going to be heading back into the classroom. They so desperately need that, but there will be at least until January is what we hear in our district before the older kids get to even start in any kind of hybrid learning. So please invite people, send them that direction. If you have neighbors that are struggling, family members that are struggling, somebody in the grocery store, for heaven's sake, we want to support people that are walking through really tough challenges in trying to educate their kids, and oftentimes work from home as well. So, and we hope that this will be a blessing to those that come, and we are just so excited. I bought school supplies. It was so fun for me. I love the school supply aisle, like fresh markers and colored pencils and crayons, and individual for every person, of course, so that we can keep the germs at bay. But all right, so if you are interested, it is not too late to sign up. It's not too late to share the link with somebody. There's flexibility as to when your arrival time is, when your departure time is. We just want to meet families' needs within the hours of 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., so we won't be helping you at midnight. The way that you do that is by going to thevillage@brookview.com, and that will have all the details that you need to get information about what it is, and then to reach out to us and sign up online as well. So, Trevor, super excited for you this week. Yeah, let's go. All right, without talking anymore, I'm going to hand this off to Jason.
You guys, can I just say, was that not amazing to have like the Brookview Dixie Chicks up here? Oh my gosh. So like Jen said, we had worship, we had just musicians and worship people dropping like flies over the last, and then this morning we lost 2 more. including our sound guy. So the bass player's sound guy is here running sound for the first time ever. Can you imagine walking up there and running the board? Nathan, you're killing it. Let's go. So I would just say I am so thankful for people being flexible and people being able to step into something. And, there's a little bit of fear with that for Jen and I think for all the musicians because they've never played together like that, never even played these songs together. And on top of that, it's just not like the ideal situation. And what I will say is in COVID, if we're not willing to do stuff unless it's perfectly ideal, we're going to be real limited. So I'm really thankful for people just stepping out in courage. And because that's all going on, I have the keyboard right here. And if the Spirit leads, I may preach with the song. I don't know how this is going to go. Oh, yeah, let's go. I've been warming up, so. These past months have been nothing like I've ever seen in my life. We've got people quarantining and being obviously, as we know, physically cut off from one another. But then you add in all of the political and all of the racial division. I have never seen people so isolated and so divided. In our world right now, I think there is this pervasive sense of loneliness. And it's not just the physical separation. Like, it is that. But it's also this emotional separation, this sense that we're not really seen, that we're not really known, that we're not valued. And Jesus taught that we are wired as human beings. We are wired for community, to know and be known, to love and be loved. We're wired to only thrive when we're engaged in meaningful community. And yet these days, many are being swallowed up by loneliness. This sense of relational isolation is it's overwhelming. So much of our world is shut down and it's unavailable to us. It's so frustrating. But in addition to that, I think there's something else that's making it worse. And it's not an external problem. It's an internal issue. It's something that can happen inside of any of us that can isolate us. And today we're going to look more deeply at this inner struggle that we all wrestle with at times. We're going to look at Paul's famous words in Philippians chapter 2. Now, Philippians is a letter written to Christians in the first century by Paul, and they lived in the city of Philippi. That's why it's called Philippians. And Philippi, that church, was a church that Paul had started himself. But Paul left them, and then he did other ministry in other places, and then he was imprisoned. Okay, so imagine if after 17 years, Jen and I moved somewhere else away from Brookview, and we did like ministry somewhere else, and then we got thrown in prison. I mean, it could happen, right? And so imagine that we are in prison for telling people about Jesus, and from prison, I wrote you, okay, Brookview, a letter. Okay, that's what Philippians is. It is a letter from prison, and it is deeply personal. Paul reminds them of all the things that he had taught them, the deep love of God in Christ. He reminds them that of everything that God is up to in the world. He encourages them to live differently than they used to live and to live differently from this world, to love one another deeply, to really love one another. So that's where we pick this up in Philippians chapter 2. Again, Paul writing to people that he loves deeply, but he cannot come to see. And he writes this. It says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Now, this is extreme, right? I mean, think about it. This is extreme. This is not how our world works. So Paul reminds his friends where this idea comes from. That if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, this was his way. And here we come to a very famous passage of Scripture. And many scholars, most scholars, believe that Paul, in this next section, was quoting a Christian hymn, okay, a worship song. So imagine if in the middle of my sermon, I just went over to the piano here. No, I don't. I just said to you vocally, I just said, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." We all know it. Okay, you would all recognize those words as not mine. You would realize that those are poetry that have been set to music, and that those are very, very well-known words. Well, here, Paul quotes for his friends well-known poetry set to music. It was a song about the humility of Jesus, our ultimate example. And it had been around for quite some time before Paul quoted it here, which is staggering because this talks all about the divinity of Jesus, Jesus being God in the flesh. People want to say that Christians must have made that up like many generations later. No, it's right here from the beginning. Paul wants us to follow the example of our King. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Value others above yourselves. He wants us to follow the example of our King. So he writes, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And then he quotes this song, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Many scholars believe that Paul added that in himself. He's adding new lyrics. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place, back to the lyrics, and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Today, I want to think about a characteristic that absolutely defines our world. We live in a world saturated with pride. I'm going to give you some characteristics of pride and see if these describe anyone you might know. Maybe you know someone who always makes the conversation about them. Like you're telling a story, and it's your story, and it's a good story. And they hijack the conversation, and pretty soon they're telling you their story because this whole thing is all about them. Maybe you know someone who one-ups everything in a conversation. Like you talk about something cool, they have something cooler. You share something hard, they have something harder. You have something to say that's funny, they got something funnier, right? Or maybe you know somebody who is just competing with you nonstop. And you get the sense that your success is their failure. Or maybe you know somebody who constantly puts you down. They love keeping you in your place, just keeping you down. Maybe you know somebody who's always trying to prove that they're really smart. And so they use the biggest words possible. They love their own intellect. They love to hear themselves speak or hear themselves blog or whatever. And maybe you know somebody who will step on anyone. Their whole life is just an exercise in ladder climbing, and they will step on anybody that they need to climb a little bit higher. Maybe you know someone who won't be associated with you because you are way too low on the hierarchy for them to be seen with you. Unless, of course, they feel lonely. Then they'll talk to you. Maybe you know someone that only does nice things for people so they can post about it. And you've realized the only reason they do any kind of nice thing is to get people to say, "Oh my goodness, you're amazing." Maybe you know somebody who uses an inflated job title. You guys know what I mean? An inflated, like they're talking about work and they tell you that they are like a cultural architect. a coach of spirituality and personal development, but in reality, that person is just the pastor at Brookview. We live in a world that is saturated with pride. I'm curious, a moment ago, how many of you, as I shared those descriptions, how many of you had a specific person come to mind? Shame on you for judging. Pride is something that we can so easily see around us, right? We so easily see this in other people. Here's the tricky thing. We are usually really blind to pride in ourselves. We are completely turned off by it when we see it in others, and yet rarely do we imagine that we're guilty of it ourselves. Pride can be present in us, and we don't see it at all. And if you want to know how proud you are, then ask yourself these kinds of things. Like, how much does it bug me when other people talk down to me? Or how much does it bug me if they ignore me or insult me or steal credit from me? How much does it bug me when someone else shows off? See, the more pride you have, the more someone else's pride is going to drive you crazy. Your pride is in competition with everybody else's pride. It's because I wanted to shine, I really wanted to shine, that it bugs me so much when you outshine me. And this leads us to the real darkness of pride. Pride is always divisive. The essence of pride is competition and division. If I'm competing with you, then your success will be my failure, and your failure will be my success. Pride is competitive by nature. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something. It only gets pleasure out of having more of it than someone else. I mean, we say that people are proud of being rich or smart or good looking or whatever. They're not. They're proud of being richer or smarter or better looking than someone else. That's how pride works. So the essence of what pride does is it makes everybody else my competitors. When my pride is flared up and it's in effect, I cannot root for you. And this is why pride is so divisive. It's an anti-love state of mind. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. I thought you said this sermon was about loneliness. Yes, it is. Okay, so why are we talking about pride? Because pride destroys relationships. Pride will lock you in a prison of loneliness. It will. Pride disables people from connecting and loving one another. The spiritual fathers, who thought a lot about human brokenness, concluded this, that pride is actually the mother of all sins. I mean, we like to, in the Christian world, we like to kind of elevate certain sins above others. You think about things in this realm of sexuality or violence or whatever. They're like, no. Pride is the mother of all sins. Have you guys heard of the 7 deadly sins? Yeah, okay. Pride is considered the deadliest of them all. Why? Because pride breaks down our relationships with people, and pride also prevents us from having a relationship with God. Question. You guys ever met like a really arrogant Christian? No? When you meet a really arrogant Christian, something feels off about it, right? I mean, an arrogant, self-centered, superior, self-righteous Jesus follower. Like, isn't that a whole slew of oxymorons? It is. And C.S. Lewis describes for us why this feels so wrong to us when we encounter it. He says, in God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. That's kind of threatening. And unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are always looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. And this raises a terrible question. How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten up with pride can say they believe in God and appear to themselves as very religious? I'm afraid it means they are worshiping an imaginary God. They theoretically admit themselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but are really all the time imagining how he approves of them and thinks them far better than ordinary people. I suppose it was of those people Christ was thinking when he said that some would preach about him and cast out devils in his name, only to be told at the end of the world that he had never known them. And any of us may at any moment be in this death trap. Okay, now for some of you, maybe you're here and you're thinking, well, I don't struggle with pride. Like, if anything, I'm like the opposite of proud. Okay, I struggle with insecurity. I lack confidence, and I feel insecure, and I feel like I don't measure up, and I'm jealous of people who are so confident, and I'm not. And in fact, my issue really is insecurity, not arrogance. So I don't really think that any of this applies to me. Guys, pride doesn't just manifest as arrogance or superiority. Pride secretly disguises itself as insecurity. Pride is the intrinsic tendency that we have to compete and compare. And when we compete, we can win or we can lose. The arrogant person is the one that's convinced they're winning. The insecure, inferior, man, I really suck person feels like they're losing. So what is the opposite of pride? Well, it's not inferiority or insecurity. What is the opposite of pride? It's humility. Now, humility is very different from insecurity or inadequacy. Okay, the humble person is actually really secure and simply refuses to compete and compare to everybody else. The humble person is free. They're free to know you. They're free to celebrate you. They're free to be impressed by you. They're free to root for you. Why? Because your success isn't their failure, because they're not competing with you. It isn't about them. It has never been about them. And that's humility. John Piper writes this. I don't quote John Piper a lot, but so consider this a blessing. But John Piper writes this. If somebody's right, I'll quote him. I don't care if it's Madonna or I don't care. He's right. He says, consider the relationship between boasting and self-pity. Both are manifestations of pride. Boasting is a response of pride to success. Self-pity is a response of pride to suffering. Boasting says, I deserve admiration because I've achieved so much. Self-pity says, I deserve admiration because I've sacrificed so much. Boasting is the voice of pride in the heart of the strong. Self-pity is the voice of pride in the heart of the weak. Boasting sounds self-sufficient. Self-pity sounds self-sacrificing. The reason self-pity does not look like pride is that it appears to be needy, but the need arises from a wounded ego, and the desire of self-pity is not for others to see that they are helpless, but that they are heroes. The need self-pity feels does not come from a sense of unworthiness, but a sense of unrecognized worthiness. It is the response of the unapplauded pride. Pride secretly disguises itself as insecurity. Guys, whether we're on the weak or strong side of it, it is pride. It means that we are comparing and we are competing, and whether we feel like winners or losers, it is a big, fat problem either way. It is divisive either way. Now, we live in a world saturated by pride. We don't even know how to operate outside of this, really. And this is where Jesus is calling us to become something different. Jesus showed us a completely different way. Jesus showed us the way of humility. Jesus was never about self-promotion or self-glorification. Jesus wasn't concerned with looking impressive. Jesus was truly free to love and to serve. And Jesus is inviting us into his way. So let's look again at verse 6. It says, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. This is the New Living Translation of that same verse. And I really like it. Because the Greek word that gets translated to cling to is kind of interesting. It's the only place in the Bible where it's used. In this place, right here in Philippians, is the only place where that word is used. It's most often translated to cling or to clutch or to grasp. And at the time of Jesus, this word was used to mean different things. First, it meant that I'm clutching to something that's mine. You ever clutch to something? You ever watch a 2-year-old clutch to something that's theirs? Okay, so clutching something I already have because I'm afraid you might take it from me, and I refuse to let it go. Second, grabbing for something I don't yet have. Have you ever seen a 2-year-old? So reaching and clamoring and striving for something that I want but don't yet have. And then third, using an advantage to promote yourself or exploit others. Using an advantage to step on others and climb higher. I have the power in this moment, and I'm going to use it to push you down and elevate myself. So it means clutching rather than holding something loosely. I'm clutching it. It means grasping rather than waiting for something to come to me. And it means using an advantage to promote myself or climb above somebody else. And see, these were the three things that if you follow the life of Jesus, you see he refused to do any of them. He didn't clutch onto his divinity. He held it loosely. He lived humbly as a servant to all. He didn't grasp for everybody to recognize his greatness. Instead, he waited for God to exalt him in God's way, in God's time, to give him the name that is above every name. And he certainly didn't use his divinity or his power to promote himself. In fact, his disciples often couldn't understand what he was doing. Like they'd seen the power that he held, and they wanted him to use it more. But again and again, he just refused to power up. So how in the world do you and I begin to actually live the way of Jesus? How do we embrace that kind of humility? And I just want to throw out a question that I think, according to Paul, is the key. And it's simply this. What if we refuse to clutch, but just held things loosely? See, when we're constantly competing for position or status, then we have to always be wary of somebody climbing past us. What if they become more than us? What if they surpass us? What if they take what we feel belongs to us? But Jesus shows us that it's actually freeing to hold things loosely. So what if they exceed us? So what if we aren't recognized? So what if someone else gets more credit or more honor than us? It's interesting, one time Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. And he said, of those born of a woman, there is none greater than John. Now that's a really like Yoda way to say it, right? Of those born of a woman. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, John is the greatest person to ever live. Why doesn't Jesus just say that? Because sometimes he's Yoda-like. Okay. John is the great, because we're born of women. So that's all of us. So now, what is it that John the Baptist, what was it about him that was so great that Jesus would go on and say this? Well, there's no way for any of us to know exactly what Jesus had in his mind in that moment. But here's what we know. Like Jesus, John held things really loosely. He didn't clutch and hold tightly to his own status. It's amazing if you know the story. If you remember, prior to Jesus growing in renown and celebrity, John was very, very famous in Palestine, right? People were coming to him by the thousands, and he was baptizing them by the thousands. And John had become this legendary prophet and preacher. But over time, Jesus started attracting John's crowds. They left John and they went to Jesus. And much more even, like Jesus was preaching, but he was preaching better than John. Jesus was healing people. He was healing the blind and the deaf and the lepers. Jesus was bringing people back from the dead. John's followers are like, dude, Jesus fed thousands with just a few fish and loaves. Jesus rebuked storms, cast out demons, walked on water. And so one day, John's disciples came to him. They were getting frustrated by this. And they came to him and they said, hey man, have you seen what Jesus and his guys are doing over there? At first it was just Jesus' guys are baptizing people. They're like, isn't that your thing? I mean, seriously, you're like John the Baptist. So, do you want us to just head on over there and shut that thing down? And the response of John to his own guys was so dang Jesus-y. Right? Do you remember what he said? John was like, you know what? Actually, it doesn't bother me one bit. I had my time, and now it's his time. He must become greater. I must become less. What was it that made John the greatest? Maybe part of it was that he actually knew how to hold things loosely. God had exalted him, and now God was exalting Jesus. His role needed to shift, and he was perfectly okay with it shifting. John let God do the exalting, and he refused to clutch and grasp and cling. Guys, when you think about it, what if every Christian had that mindset? What if instead of clutching and holding tightly, what if we sought out ways to enable others to succeed and to flourish? But this is absolutely not how our world works. This is different. But this is the kind of thing that people are actually drawn to. Like someone that's truly rooting for us, like even if we outshine them, well, that's different. That's beautiful. Like to hold loosely. This is Jesus' kind of freedom. This is life. This is love. So how do we let go of pride and begin to embrace humility? Well, I think it begins with this. What if we refuse to clutch, but held things loosely? And then second, what if we walked humbly through the valleys of obscurity? What do you do when no one is recognizing you? What do you do when you walk through the valley of obscurity? I mean, maybe you find yourself, some of you, maybe you find yourself in that season like right now. You know that you are capable of great things, or you're already doing great things, but nobody's seeing it. You're not getting opportunities. You're not getting recognition. You feel unseen, unknown, unrecognized. See, how you handle that, it says so much about you. And I think a classic example of walking through the valley of obscurity well is David. So often when we think of David, we think of his glory. We think of him defeating Goliath, and then everybody's praising his name, right? And he's famous in Israel. We think of his time leading the army to great victories. We think of David as the majestic king. But you guys, David spent years in the valley of obscurity. Does anybody remember what David did before he was anointed king? He's a shepherd. He was a shepherd. He tended sheep. Does anybody remember what he did right after he was anointed king? He was a shepherd, and he tended sheep for years and years and years after he was anointed king. He had been promised a kingdom, but he was still a shepherd, and he was there for a really long time with no end in sight. What did David do in the valley of obscurity? Well, David learned to get in touch with his soul. He sought hard after God. He prayed and he wrote worship music, and he trusted God's timing. And he worked on his character, and he worked on his interior life, and he spent very little time worrying about recognition. He let God take care of bringing all of that. He refused to grasp for what he did not have. Now you think about how many of the Psalms were written when he was struggling in some way, when success and fame and recognition were actually nowhere to be found. I mean, you think about his most famous words. Psalm 23. Right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. What season of his life do you think that came from? Well, he tells us in the next verse. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. In the valley of obscurity, David got in touch with his soul, and he sought hard after God, and God met him there. Why? Because God longs to meet us. Maybe some of you are finding yourself walking through the valley of obscurity. Right now in your life, there's just not a lot of recognition. Right now in your life, you are not being showered with awards. Maybe you feel that way at work. I mean, you're like, come on, man, I'm killing it. I'm slaying it. But nobody's really seeing and no one is really noticing. Or maybe your main job is being at home with little ones. And you are loving them and you are serving them with your whole heart. And you go to bed exhausted every single day. And no one is saying to you, Mommy, you're killing it. Right? I love how you disciplined me today and didn't let me have the extra cookies. Right? Daddy, you're killing it. You don't even have your spouse saying, honey, you're killing it. And it just feels like a really thankless job. Or maybe for some of you, you've got a sibling that is super successful. And when you're with your parents, you feel how proud they are. They brag about your brother. They brag about your sister. But you're just walking through the valley of obscurity. No one sees. No one knows. No one appreciates. See, how you walk through that valley, it says so much about who you are. And even more, it prepares the way for who God wants you to become. Those valleys are often the most formative seasons of our lives. What do we do in the valley of obscurity? What do we do in the valley? What happens there, it will reveal the real you, and it can build the inner you like nothing else. So if you're in one of those valleys right now, I just want to give you a couple of thoughts to close out this message. First, use this time to deepen your intimacy with God. If you've been around Brookview for a very long few years, you've probably heard me talk a few times about one of those valleys for me. Jen and I, we had the dream of starting Brookview, and we had that dream for 5 years before we actually moved here to do this. So we've been at it for 17 years, and we invested ourselves in it 5 years before that, 22 years. That's insane. You guys are worth it, but man, so I needed to go to school and I needed to get training. I had a bachelor's degree from Western, and so I needed to get some theological and biblical training. And so I went to grad school at Trinity Western Seminary in Canada. Now that took 3 more years, and in that time I did an internship at our church in Bellingham. And I was teaching and I was preaching and I was leading ministries, and I was getting all of this really invaluable training and experience that I desperately needed because I didn't know what I was doing at all. And it was really growing and it was really developing. And you guys, the thing was, like, I loved it. I felt like I was doing what I was made to do. So after 3 years, I finished grad school and I completed my internship, and I'm like, all right, let's go, let's do this. Jen and I had this burning passion to move down here and to start this church, but things did not come together in the way that we'd hoped at all. Everything just ended up being delayed. And so instead of coming here and starting the church, I got a job in an oil refinery for what I hoped would be like 2 months. Okay, I was sure this was just going to be temporary because we were just about to get all the pieces to come together. I was a low-level laborer, and I was like, that's fine, I just need something temporary. But things kept getting delayed. And they kept getting delayed and getting delayed and getting delayed. And you guys, I spent almost 2 years working in that refinery. Now, for you, you're like, 2 years, this is like not a big deal. I'm like, it felt like forever. Because I felt like I had developed all of these skills to be able to preach and teach and lead. And instead, I was a laborer in an oil refinery. I was walking through the valley of obscurity. And you talk about not getting recognition. Okay, just so you know, an oil refinery is not known to be an environment of positivity and recognition. And I remember one day I was sitting with my crew at a break time. My crew was about 7 or 8 people usually. And a foreman from another crew came over to talk to us. Now, I didn't know him, but he was a big deal in the refinery. He was well respected. He was a really big deal. And he came over with his crew. Now, I was the lowest level you could be in the refinery. You guys want to know what my title was? I was a helper. which means you don't know how to do anything. You just stand there and someone goes, I need help. And you go, yeah, I'm a helper. So for some reason, this big shot guy comes over and is talking with the crew. Someone in my crew, I don't know why they volunteered this, someone in my crew, and they did it like to be kind and with some pride. They said, hey, check this out. Jason here has a master's degree. Isn't that cool? And this foreman, his name is Elton, I'll never forget him, had never met me before. He looked at me and said in front of his crew and my crew, you have a master's degree and you work here? You ain't too smart, are you? You guys know what I said? Nothing. I mean, what are you going to say, right? I mean, for so many reasons, that season just felt like obscurity. Every day, coveralls, coming home, many days looking like a coal miner. I'm not teaching, I'm not preaching, I'm not leading. But that season, you guys, was actually very special for me. And it was very critical for me. Because in that season, I learned a ton about myself. In that season, I got in touch with my soul. And in that season, I sought God like I had never sought God before. And it wasn't to prep a message. It wasn't to lead some group or some study. It was just to know him. I needed him. And God met me powerfully in that valley. And I think about who I am, who God has grown me to become. That season in the refinery was irreplaceable in developing my soul. I mean, to be honest, it's in the valleys that God has grown me most. I'm constantly longing for success and recognition, and that hasn't changed. I'm still longing for success and recognition. So if you're like, hey, maybe I shouldn't put a positive card on the comments because it would inflate his pride. No, you put that on there. I pursue it, okay? But looking back, I realize, you guys, when I've grown most, I have grown in the valley of obscurity. So if you find yourself in that valley right now, then you should know this is a season of immense opportunity. If you can get in touch with your soul and you can seek God, he may meet you in profound ways and he may fill you. Now, you may not hear, you're killing it from anybody else, but I just want to tell you, God sees and he knows and he cares. So in the valley of obscurity, above all else, deepen your intimacy with God. Okay, and then second, somehow you have to find ways to serve others. That refinery season was incredibly deepening for me because, you guys, after several months, I got to really know the people on my crew. And I came to, adore them. And I realized they were not the kind of people that I had been hanging out prior to my experience there. But they were smart, and they were funny, and they were kind, but also insecure. They were a lot like me. They wanted to feel respected, but a lot of time, they didn't. So I spent that time getting to know them and doing my best to just love them. I got to know their families, many of them. They invited Jen and I and our kids to places. I got to know their families. I got to know their dreams. I prayed for them every morning before work. You're like, oh, that's no, overstate. No, I prayed for them every morning before work. Seriously, I would pull into that parking lot. I would look at that refinery. And every workday, I would pray for them before I went into that place. And sometimes when it made sense, I would pray with them face to face. They would share a dream with me or a fear or an area of pain in their life. And if the moment felt right, I would say, hey, can I pray for you? And you guys, every time they would say, yes, please. And even in the valley, I saw beauty. I saw so much beauty, and I had ministry. What I learned in the valley was that people are people. Whether they have PhDs or didn't even graduate from high school. Whether they had braces and have perfect teeth or they're missing half their teeth. People are people. Whether they make $300,000 a year or $30,000 or $3,000, people are people. They want to be seen, and they want to be heard, and they want to be respected, and they have fears, and they have hopes, and they have dreams, and they have pain. And everybody, when you start to actually get into their life, they have pain. And if you can become safe to them, and if they trust that you are actually rooting for them, every once in a while, they'll share it with you. John Dixon, who's a historian that has studied the power of humility, wrote this once. He said, "The most believable person in the world is the person you know has your best interest in their heart." And this has absolutely been true in my experience. When I look at the people who want me to speak into their life, and when I look at the people that I want to speak into my life, the most believable person in the world is the person you know has your best interest in their heart. I was thinking about the reality that right now, you guys, so many of us are in a valley. We're in so many valleys, person after person in our church. Like, why can't we get musicians? Valleys. And for some of you, it isn't just any valley, it is literally the valley of obscurity. Maybe not literally, that's kind of metaphorical. But it is the valley of obscurity. You don't feel seen, you don't feel noticed, you don't feel celebrated. And you guys, if that's you and that's where you are, what you do in that valley, it says so much about you. And it impacts how deep that valley becomes for you. You can make it worse. And so I just want to close by asking you, who can you serve right now? And how can you serve them? Because you can compete and compare with the people around you, or you can quit grasping and clutching and just serve. So who can you serve right now, and how can you serve them? Who are the people that are in your world right now? And some of you go, man, I'm quarantining, man. I'm watching this on a computer screen. I haven't seen another person. You know what? There's things like email, telephones. You can still build people up. You can still have relationships with people. You can still serve people. Who are the people in your world right now? And do they find you believable because they know that you have your best interest in your heart? Their best interest in your heart. Here's the thing. These past few months have had so many relational barriers. So many external things that are creating isolation. And you and I, we can't control most of that. We just can't. But you can compound it anytime you start to compare and compete. Because whether you win or lose, you lose. And so do those in your life around you. Whenever you grasp and clutch and compete, there is a wall that goes up between you and the people around you. And maybe you say, nah, I don't think so, man. Because I just do it internally, and they don't even know I'm doing it. Really? Are you sure they don't know? You think you're that sneaky and smart? People are smart, man. They can read it. They have a sense for this kind of stuff. And if you really want to connect, you have to find a way to let it go. Because the more you grasp, the lonelier you will be. Why would you want to do that to yourself? And why would you want to do that to them? Jesus is inviting you and me into the better way. The question is, will we follow his example? Will we humble ourselves and serve? Will we let God exalt us? Because when you think about loneliness, what if this is actually like the secret key? Father in heaven, I thank you for the reality that not only did we receive like forgiveness and grace because of the cross, but in the life of Jesus, in the way that all went down, we see what it looks like to live differently, to live free, to not grasp and clutch and cling, but to hold everything loosely, to do the right thing every time, and then trust that you've got this. That when the time is right, you will exalt. God, I pray for all of us here. I pray, and those online, God, would you help us identify areas where we are just competing and comparing with the people around us in ways that are putting up walls? Would you help us to let go of that, to celebrate, to encourage and provide opportunities for other people to succeed and flourish, and then to just step back and be so happy about it? God, would you help us to connect on a heart level with the people around us? Would you teach us what it is to love? In Jesus' name.